Today I'll be speaking with a very interesting person. Her name is Aspen Robinson, and she's a trauma-informed coach. She's been working with people for over 10 years, especially adults who have suffered with childhood trauma and are still dealing with the impact of that trauma in their day-to-day life. Currently, she is studying to be a somatic therapist practitioner, which is someone who can help a person deal with trauma that is trapped in the body. Aspen has a ton of experience when it comes to family dynamics that cause childhood trauma. Today, we'll be unpacking different toxic and dysfunctional family dynamics. Different forms of dysfunction can lead to different emotional issues in the child, which can also lead to emotional issues in adulthood later in life. Aspen will not only help unpack some of the topics that we share today, but will also be offering some practical tips and strategies to help us as adults today navigate life if we do have childhood trauma. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and please pass it along to anyone that you think could benefit. Hi, Aspen. It's so good to see you again. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. I haven't had a trauma-informed coach on the podcast yet, and I'm really thrilled to do a deep dive all into dysfunctional family dynamics. But before we begin, could you maybe share a little bit about yourself and about the work that you do with our listeners?
Yeah, so I've been in this field for about 10 years at this point, and it started truly because of healing my own trauma, my own experiences. And I mainly work with adults who have had childhood trauma and it's still impacting them as an adult. And so that over the years has become kind of the lens that I've worked under. And I really help people understand how the dysfunction in their family or the trauma and patterns in their family have shaped their life.
Can you help me define what you mean by trauma?
So there's a really beautiful quote by Gabor Mate that says that trauma is any situation we're in where there's an absence of support and we are overwhelmed in that moment. So it doesn't have to be anything huge or what we typically think of as trauma. It truly in childhood can be a moment where something was overpowering or overwhelming, maybe too painful, and there was a lack of support or person to help us through it. So it's really like the essence of being alone in pain that's too overwhelming for us.
Is this specific to children or to young adults or anyone under the age of 18, or would you use this definition across the board?
I would say it's good across the board. The difference is when you're younger, you rely on other people, parents, caregivers to let you know that you're safe in the world, that you're not alone in your pain or your fear or whatever it is that you're going through. And so as a child, you really are more powerless to take care of yourself, protect yourself, to navigate that situation. So it actually has a lot more impact in our developing years. Whereas when we're an adult, we can reach for resources, we can ask for help, we can have more opportunity to make choice in our life. And so it is far more traumatic a lot of times in childhood when we deal with these things because of that factor.
It's more intense on the child's brain. It's more intense on an underdeveloped brain, I assume, is what you're saying as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I have a feeling we're going to talk about different types of trauma. Some would call, capital T trauma as the very abusive and very obvious traumas, domestic violence, sexual violence, things like that. But then I know there's like nuanced traumas, things like dealing with, again, dysfunctional family members. So an emotionally unavailable parent, an immature parent, a silent parent. So I've never really done a deep dive into these different types of dynamics. Maybe we just start with, how would you define what a dysfunctional family is?
Yeah, so I would say a dysfunctional family is any family that has patterns of behavior, whether it's emotional, physical, or even just mental, like the beliefs and thought patterns of a family that are harmful to the individuals of a family, either because they suppress a person's ability to ask for what they need and advocate for themselves, to be heard and listened to, or because they cause some type of emotional, psychological harm to that person. And so there's many, many degrees of that. And when we're talking about trauma, there's big T trauma, which most of us are familiar with, which would be abuse, physical and sexual, Rarely do we consider emotional abuse in that category. We have a tendency to overlook it. But then we also have small t traumas, which are, a family moving and leaving their grandparents in another place, or parents getting divorced, or just small things in childhood that are small t traumas but still impact us in really profound ways because they were meaningful to us on an individual level.
One definition of trauma I've come across is that if anything happens that's outside our window of tolerance. So, as you're saying, if we leave our loved ones, we have to change schools, we're moving countries, and it's outside of our window of tolerance, and our nervous system is activated in a stressful way, or is responding in an extremely aroused state in a very activated way, then that could be a type of trauma, which is what you're saying. You're right, we don't talk a lot about the nuances around emotional abuse. I think it's very obvious if, someone is being yelled at incessantly and violently all the time. But what are some of the nuanced situations where a child could be emotionally abused?
Yes, and I think this is one we're so easy to overlook. And emotional abuse can look like emotional withholding. So a parent withholding their love or their care, this would fall in like the category of silent treatment. Or I only love you, approve of you, or speak to you even if you've made me happy or done what I wanted. That can be a form of emotional abuse. Emotional manipulation is a big one. So when you are parented or you're in a relationship with someone where there is guilting and shaming, meaning that if you don't do what they like, they make you feel guilty or bad for what you did, versus just having a healthy conversation about it and being able to repair it. So these forms of emotional manipulation and abuse are subtle sometimes. It can be the words that are constantly spoken to us. It can be the criticism veiled as I do this because I love you, or I just don't want you to struggle with that. With women, a lot of times as children, our mothers will teach us that we need to be thin or we need to dress a certain way. And so these can all be forms of emotional abuse because it can start to impact our self-esteem and our self-worth. And it shifts the way we see ourselves into, oh my gosh, am I going to be acceptable or safe around these people if I show up authentically? Or do I have to mask and create all of these coping mechanisms in order to be safe and accepted in my family or in my society?
Would you argue that parents, obviously, I want to say that all parents or most parents do or behave in a way with their children that makes sense for them. They're always doing the best that they can. And a lot of the times it's learned through generational type of parenting or conditioning and sometimes generational trauma. Even if a parent is treating a child in a way that's harmful to them, they don't actually know they're doing that. Like your example of you better be thin, otherwise you're not good enough. That's probably coming from a mother who also was parented that way and was told that you're not valuable in society unless you're thin. So she's trying to protect her daughter, but actually is causing self-esteem issues. So would you argue that this is passed on and that a lot of the times parents are just unaware that they're doing this? And how can we bring parents to awareness? And maybe would you argue that all families have these types of like dysfunctions and that all parents have maybe a limited or an unhealthy sometimes approach to child rearing?
Yes, I think that so much of it does get passed on. And so a lot of times we teach what we know. We parent how we were parented unless, we've learned something different or our parenting was so bad and painful that we're like, I'm never going to do that again. So there's many shades of it. And not all forms of emotional abuse specifically are intentional. And I think this is where the conversation really kind of starts to go sideways sometimes when we have this conversation between adult children and adult parents, is that it's not about blame, because as generations go on, we all have a different set of rules that we're being asked to play by. And so those rules do tend to get handed down, and not all of those behaviors and patterns and expectations are intentionally meant to hurt someone. The work is in recognizing them as adults, as, this is how I was parented and it really hurt me. It injured me. It had some impact. And being able to have those conversations with our own parents so that we can have some resolution or even repair work. And that's really what I think is so important is we need parents to be able to listen to a child without feeling like they're being blamed, to hear their experience, and then to work together to repair that. That way we can move forward and recognize these unhealthy patterns within families.
And what are some other examples of dysfunction that can be under the umbrella term of emotional abuse that we can discuss?
Yes. So, probably the most well known, because there is a really great book about it, is Emotionally Immature Parents. So, there's a book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, and it's brought a lot of awareness to this. And so, this book really speaks to this idea of emotional trauma in childhood and what happens when you have parents who are not provided the tools or aren't emotionally mature enough to help you understand what you're feeling, to help you navigate what you're going through in childhood, and how that puts the burden on the child to learn how to become emotionally mature at a really young age, because they have to try and navigate that situation for a parent who doesn't know how to necessarily show up. Included in the emotionally immature parent is usually the parent that sees the world as very black or white. And so their version of everything is either right or wrong, good or bad, and there's no gray space in between. And that's really hard on a child, because children are really trying to explore things and figure things out, and they want to know that they're safe to do this and to fail and to mess up without a parent being, like you did a wrong thing, or you're a bad child, or putting some type of shame or blame on them. And so that's a key marker usually of emotionally immature parents. Another one is that anytime you take a problem to them, they either make it about themselves, and it's, oh, you're hurting my feelings, I would never do that to you, or I only do this because I love you. So this sense of they don't want to feel shame and guilt themselves, and so they will turn it back to manipulating the child, so that the child is then like, no, 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 that's not what I meant, or I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, when originally the child was the one that needed the support. So emotionally immature parents show up a lot. They also show up with parents who did not have a lot of opportunity, meaning either because of their life, because of their own family of origin, society, whatever it might be. And so they tend to have these unrealized dreams that can also get projected onto the child, which means that as a child, you're not allowed to show up and just be yourself with your own interests, with the things that light you up and maybe, spark that kind of light inside of you. They want you to fulfill their unrealized dream because they never got the opportunity to, and they don't know how to.
You mentioned a few things there. You mentioned the kind of black or white mindset. And the second thing, which is the unrealized dream. How does this impact a child growing up with parents like this in this type of household later on in life, in adulthood, or in relationships of their own?
I would say one of the things that stands out the most when I work with people is this feeling of perfectionism and this pattern of needing to get it right. And part of needing to get it right or get it perfect or do the best job possible is because you're trying to avoid shame and guilt. And connected to that is this idea that there's a really high level of expectation for me. And I'm always trying to achieve that because my parents have put a lot of expectation on me for their own unrealized dreams. And so you get stuck in these patterns of perfectionism and then overworking, people pleasing. Those are two other areas that tend to show up because you're constantly trying to meet a goal that there's no possible way to reach. The bar is always moving for you because your worth has been connected to what I earn or accomplish or do for others. And so it's all this external validation that's driving you versus the realization that I'm lovable just as I am. I'm good as I am and belong as I am. And so that's how that can start to shape our personality and this feeling of like flight in our body and constantly needing to do and achieve.
And what's some advice you could give to an adult who's going through what you just described and who has perfectionism tendencies, people pleasing that stems from childhood?
The first thing I would say is that you're going to feel really unsafe when you start to work on this. You're going to feel like you're doing something wrong, like something bad is going to happen or something is going to fall through the cracks. And to recognize that that is absolutely normal. And just because you're feeling that way doesn't make it true. You're also not alone in that. So that would be the first thing, is compassion for yourself, patience for yourself, and to look at what it is with your goals and the way that you're living your life that are actually your parents and don't really matter to you versus what is actually important to you. So I find it's important here just to make a short list almost of, these are the goals my parents have put on me, and do I really value them? You may value some of them, you may keep a couple of them. And then what are the ones that are actually more important to me? And what happens if I start to focus on that list of what is just important to me? And that is a way to start breaking down that kind of perfectionism and that drive we have sometimes to achieve. So coupled in that, I would also say, because you're going to feel unsafe, I always tell people, stack the deck with safety. It's going to be hard to realize that it's okay for you to fail and to mess up, and for you to maybe just do it 80% of the way. You're still going to have the same level of like accomplishment most of the time. And so I tell people, stack the deck if you're feeling afraid. And that could look like, I'm going to call in support from a friend, or I'm just going to try changing this one tiny piece and not mess with the rest of it right now because that's all I can manage. Or I'm going to get extra rest this weekend before I try this new thing, because if I'm rested, I feel calmer. So it's looking for just little ways that you can make yourself feel safer, supported, or more at ease before you make these changes. And that way you don't feel so triggered by them.
I really appreciate the piece where you say, make a list between your goals and aspirations versus your parents, because I think that's a healthy exercise that we all should do in our lives, just to differentiate and discern our voice versus society's voice versus our family's voice, etc. And not that, everything our parents told us or everything school told us or society told us is bad, but it's like when you're growing up or you're an adult, at some point we have to reevaluate, reassess, and then kind of take stock. Actually, this was really beautiful about my childhood, or the way that I was raised, or the way I was conditioned. I can acknowledge its conditioning, but I still want to accept it and embrace it. And this is maybe something I internalized and I don't need, or it doesn't serve me anymore, and I can let it go. But I think that's really helpful piece of advice maybe for everybody. But coming back to the emotionally immature parent, it makes me think about this example where a parent is so immature that sometimes a child, and maybe not a very young child, although I'm not sure, maybe in your practice you'll tell me otherwise, but maybe an older child or maybe a young teenager will start to parent the parent, will almost take over. Or maybe this even happens in adulthood or early adulthood, in their, people who are in their 20s, where the parent is so emotionally reliant rather, on a child, that throughout a child's life, maybe from adolescence all the way up to young adulthood, they're almost acting like the parent. What does that look like? Is there a term for that? And how can we help someone maybe manage that or navigate it?
Yes, so that would be the parentified child. And that is where a child assumes the burden of the parent. And that can be because the parent places it on their shoulders. Sometimes you see that when parents get divorced and then they overshare with a child, and the child then becomes the therapist and has to make sure that the parent is okay, especially if they're dealing with a lot emotionally. You can see it when a child is raised in a home where the parents don't attune to or have the forethought of what does my child need. And so the child is constantly having to plan ahead, or kind of, I would say, shift or navigate the family in a way where the needs get met. So sometimes this happens with something as simple as like eating. And if a parent has depression, and say they're in bed in the morning, and the child will become parentified because they get up early and they feed themselves or they feed their siblings and they get everybody off to school. Sometimes I've had clients that have gotten up in the morning and made sure their parent got their medication so that they would be able to function throughout the day. So when that happens, sometimes we have a parent that is in a lot of shutdown, and the child has to show up, because if they don't show up, they're not going to be taken care of. And so it's a way to kind of like prop the parent up to get things met. The other thing that can happen is when there is some form of neglect, and this can be emotional neglect, it can also be physical neglect, where a child feels abandoned. And so they become parentified in the sense of, I'm not going to rely on anybody and I'm going to take care of myself. I'll make sure that my clothes are washed and that I get to school. And when I'm a teenager, I'm not going to ask anybody for help. I'll take care of everything on my own. So there are different variations of it, but it's any place where a parent should be providing and meeting the needs of the child, and the child realizes that it is not possible, or the parent refuses to do so, and the child takes on the responsibility of the parent. So if you're an adult dealing with having grown up that way, there's really two things that come to mind that I see often. And I would say, think about, if this is your experience, which one maybe resonates most for you right now. The first is that if you were parentified, you probably missed out on a lot of childhood experiences to play and explore and to figure out who you are, because you had to grow up so fast. A lot of times you then in adulthood feel like, I'm just like spinning my wheels and going through the motions, but I don't know who I am. I don't know what my purpose is. I don't even know what career I want or what I enjoy doing. So play is the best way to lean into healing if that is where you're at and that is part of your experience. I always tell people, think of life like it's a buffet. And as a young child and a teenager, our job is just to try everything and decide what we like or don't like. Safe parents help us do that. They support it, they celebrate it. And so if you're struggling with, who am I, what do I enjoy, who do I want to be, think of the buffet, try everything, and give yourself the opportunity to like or dislike things. It's not about getting it right, it's just about trying things to see what you enjoy. The other thing I would say is, if you were a parentified child who then became overly responsible, hyper independent, a lot of type A feel this way, is that it's really important to renegotiate what responsibility looks like to you, because you are probably carrying far more responsibility and not asking for help because you are so used to having to do it alone. And typically you feel unsupported, taken for granted, burned out, and exhausted. And so when that is what you're working on, it's really important to reevaluate, what is it that is actually healthy for me to carry and be responsible for, and what do I genuinely need to let go of for my own well-being.
You also mentioned an example of where there are some cases where the child might have more than what a parent had growing up, or a child could potentially be more privileged or has the opportunity to be more privileged. And you said it in the case of the parent wants the child to live out their dream. But in some cases, what if the child has more privileges already than the parent? And what advice would you give to the parent dealing with that? But then also, what does that look like in the family unit when a child is growing up with maybe potentially some jealousy? I'm not sure. Maybe it shows up as oppression. I'm also not sure. And then how does that affect them in adulthood if the parent doesn't come to terms with this potential, I don't know if you would use the word dysfunction here, but this potential blockage that they're facing?
Yes. So if you're the parent and you're recognizing that your child has access to a lot more privilege than you did, whether it's safety, resources, opportunities, maybe even just inherently who they are, because they come in with special gifts and talents, if that is something that is triggering you, that just means that there's a part of you from your own experience that's recognizing it wanted that too, to whatever degree. Might not be the exact same. And so the practice there is really about bringing it back to yourself and your own healing, making sure that you're not projecting onto your child your resentments or your anger, sometimes even just your fear of them not taking advantage of everything. Because sometimes we have children who have so much opportunity and we're like, you should do all of it. And they're like, I don't care about it. They just want to do the one thing that they really love. And we have to be really careful not to force them to have to take in all of the opportunity just because we feel like we would have loved that. Because they're also growing up with parents who are probably safer, probably have more stability in their life. If they have more opportunity and privilege, they're not growing up with our triggers, so it doesn't look the same to them. They're not stressed. And so we have to really make sure that we do our own inner work of healing and recognizing that there will be triggers when our children sometimes have more access than we do. And that is only helping us heal. It is not about our child. It is about us doing our own internal work of healing our childhood experiences and maybe regrets that we're holding on to. If you are a child who grew up with more privilege and access, and your parent did not do the work, sometimes what you can experience is jealousy and competition from a parent. And this happens a lot between mothers and daughters when a daughter is, say, really beautiful, like say physically, there's a lot, a lot that she is proud of, or there is a strong social network, or just she's very talented in a specific way, whatever it might be. Maybe it's just her personality is really like sparkly. So when you are in that dynamic, the mother can become really jealous of the daughter because what it becomes is a mirror of denied opportunities, denied experiences from life. Like there's a scarcity almost that she starts to feel. And as the child, when that gets projected onto you, you'll either come into direct conflict with your mother, and you'll find that there's a lot of this fighting and back and forth and trying to not be like your mother. And you might also notice that if you're trying to salvage the relationship with your mother, you can go in a different direction, which is, I'm going to shut down, be smaller. I don't want to trigger my mother because I feel loyal to my mother. And if I trigger her insecurities, that feels like betrayal to me. And neither experience allows a child to show up authentically as who they are. They're having to do a lot of emotional labor to navigate that situation to avoid the landmines in the relationship with the parent.
Would you say they're in a constant stress response, totally dysregulated?
Yes, it's so high stress to have a parent that is competitive or jealous of you because everything about you can feel like it's going to set them off or trigger them. And so I would say it keeps you really on guard a lot of the time.
And what does that look like in adulthood? And the reason I keep asking that question is because I think it's going to be adults who are listening to us. So they might resonate with everything we're sharing. But I want to, let them also recognize some of the symptoms that might be showing up in adulthood so they can recognize that, oh, yeah, this is maybe showing up in a way that's not serving me and is affecting me as a parent or affecting my relationships, whether in my marriage or my friends, and maybe some advice that we can offer them.
Yes, if you struggled and had to deal with this as a child, what it can teach you is that I'm always in competition with other people. And so unless I am first, I can feel worthless. Unless I'm first, I can feel like I failed or I should be embarrassed or ashamed. And first being the best at anything, having the most of something, not getting embarrassed or humiliated. So this idea of if I need to compete in order to maintain my self-esteem. That's one way that this can show up, which can lead to a lot of insecurity that's masked by this really productive behavior a lot of times. Or it can lead to this idea of I need to be really small and not trigger people in order to be accepted. So I will never be in competition with someone because if I'm in competition with someone, I've learned that I'm not going to be loved. And so I'll pull back, I'll withdraw, I'll play it really small. I won't go after my dreams. So we kind of have pendulums of which way we can tend to go when that's been our experience. But what it teaches us in either way is that it is not safe for us to show up and do our best and to still expect to be loved and belong with others.
It sounds like that second example is a fawning response, which is also a stress response. And for those listening who don't know what that is, you have the fight, flight, and freeze response. And there's also the fourth, which is a fawn response, which is basically being small or finding a way to appease conflict or appease a person in front of you just to like dilute a situation or deactivate the stress. And it can look like people pleasing or showing up small, just to not like threaten anybody and just to keep the peace, even if it means you self-abandon or it's at the expense of your own well-being and nervous system. So it does sound like a fawn response. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Is there any tips or support we can offer people who have dealt with a parent like this?
Yeah, so I think if you are specifically in the fawning response, what is going to feel really unsafe in the beginning and usually keeps people stuck in fawning is they're not wanting to push back with people, disagree with people. Not that it has to be conflict, just to assert themselves is really hard and feels very unsafe. The best thing that you can do, and I find the easier the tool is, the faster you can work through something in your system, is find a safe friend or a safe family member or anybody that you can share that you are working through this response and that you would love to have safe space with them where you can push back or you can share exactly how you feel unedited without opinion. So they're just going to hear you, receive you, witness you. And that practice of can I just show up and be raw and unedited and try not to think about what I'm saying too much before I say it can actually be really liberating, but we need to do it in the presence of safe people first. The other thing you can bring to that dynamic is things that you can celebrate with them. Say you have some wins that have happened in your life. Find a safe person and say, can we celebrate this? Can we go out to dinner and can I share with you the great thing that happened to me? Because that will also allow you to learn how to take up space for what it is that you've accomplished and you're proud of and what you find within yourself is really great.
I love that response. I think, helping someone to just express themselves and also helping them to take up space if they were taught for their whole young life while they were being parented that it's not safe to take up space. I think that's such a wonderful thing. What about fathers and sons? Are there any unhealthy dynamics there that we could unpack?
One of the things that I find with fathers and sons is that there can be emotionally withdrawn fathers, fathers that are emotionally shut down, not able to show their emotion, they're absent, they work a lot, maybe they don't participate in the son's life very much. And a pattern that can develop there is a son that shows up either constantly trying to get his father's approval and attention, kind of this, look what I've done, or trying to engage him constantly in his life. Like, do you want to play baseball with me? That type of energy. And what that can lead to in adulthood is this feeling of being shut down. Because if my emotions are continuously ignored and validated, if my father, who I look up to, is not showing me some form of validation around who I am, which is really important for fathers to do for all of their children, to validate who they are, then I'm going to grow up as a person who is unsure of themselves, probably shut down and withdrawn because I've learned that emotional connection is not available to me. And I'm probably going to hold on to some anger and resentment. So I might have a short fuse. The only emotion I might be comfortable with could be like frustration or anger because I will stuff it in, stuff it in, stuff it in, and then all of a sudden it will spill out.
What about when both parents are emotionally unavailable, not just to the children, but to themselves? I actually had a question online that, and they wanted me to ask you this, where you grow up in a household where parents don't love each other, but they're not divorced, they're still together.
So there was, what it makes me think of is there was this experiment done a long time ago called the still faced experiment. And so still is in, right, face not making any type of emotional context. And so what they did is they studied mothers and babies, and when a baby cried or showed some form of facial expression and was basically reaching out for connection and support and comfort, if a mother was depressed and had no emotion on her face, completely withdrawn, eventually what the child learned is that I'm going to go collapse into myself. I'm going to stop asking for support. I'm going to stop reaching for connection. And when that happens, there's a type of state in the nervous system called collapse. But basically, it's when we internalize and we go all the way in because we've learned that there's nobody there to support us, to meet our needs, or to connect to. When you grow up in a household with parents who are both, say, emotionally shut down or withdrawn, that same type of thing happens. And you tend to just kind of go inward. Sometimes this leads to really strong patterns of withdrawal and isolation. These can be the children who read a lot or fantasize and daydream because they're trying to escape reality because the emotional pain is so strong that they need to numb out. And it can lead into adulthood with some of the same patterns we've kind of talked about where I don't ask people for anything. I don't expect anything because I've learned that they're not available. And if my parents modeled in a relationship that they're emotionally disconnected, I also don't have a framework for what it looks like to rely on another person when I get into my own relationships. Because what I've learned to accept is somebody being emotionally distant from me. And I tend to walk into those relationships. And that is one of those things that can be really hard. A lot of people, years down the line in a relationship, will realize that they have married the same person that their parent married. And when they start to try and talk about their emotions, or they're doing some form of healing and they're trying to get it out, they're usually met with that partner saying, "You're just being emotional," or I don't know what you're talking about," or just ignoring it completely because the emotional maturity isn't there.
I also came across that experiment years ago, and it's so sad. And it makes me think of an anecdote that I think someone shared on a TED Talk, and I can't remember who shared it, where he was visiting an orphanage and it was completely silent because babies are known to cry and they're crying for their needs, whatever that need is. But because no one attended to their needs, it was a silent orphanage. And that's not normal. That's not healthy. It's just that, as you said, I'm assuming the baby went inward and knew that no one was going to comfort them. But these are very young children. Speaking of young children and young nervous systems, I would love to understand the difference between a young son and a young daughter growing up in a household and what their nervous systems need independently. Because I know you did explain to me once that they have very specific needs from their mother and their father at that young of an age.
Yes, so I think this is probably one of the most misunderstood things about the difference between boys and girls. And science has proven this, so this is something that they have been able to actually study, is that little girls' nervous systems develop much faster than little boys, meaning that girls are more independent at a younger age and less reliant on a parent's nervous system to calm and support them than boys. That doesn't mean that girls be neglected by any means, but it just means that they have a little bit more agency early on. What they found is that little boys actually need co-regulation. So this idea of like a hug and a mom or a dad that's able to support them and put a hand on their shoulder and comfort and soothe them. Boys need that up until the very least age 7 in a more direct way. And when little boys receive that, their nervous systems are much calmer. And then they start to develop their independence. And so a lot of times we flip flop this and we tend to prioritize little girls' feelings more than little boys, and we leave boys alone in their emotions, and then they tend to go inward and they start to shut down because they're taught to stop crying or to man up, or that it's not okay for them to have these feelings. But when we really support them and allow that and nurture and comfort them, they actually grow into much more emotionally healthy and stable people and stable nervous systems.
Much more emotionally regulated, and I would assume emotionally intelligent men. And I guess, if we grow up in a culture, we grow up with conditioning that boys don't cry, or maybe if they grow up with a parent, it could be a mother, but usually it's the father, where they're displaying, that kind of conventional masculinity of boys don't cry as well, probably because they were parented that way as well. Then what happens in adulthood when a man grows up that way and they haven't learned to regulate their emotions? They haven't learned emotional literacy, so how to name and define and label and feel and be okay with their emotions. So does that look like toxic masculinity? Does that look like intense aggression and anger, or just total emotional dysregulation and not being able to be in relationships?
I would say all of the above. And one of the things about aggression and anger is that a lot of times it's the only emotion boys are allowed to show. So it is the only one that they do have some literacy and understanding around. And because they are typically denied access to other emotions like heartache or sadness or anxiety, they suppress it, suppress it, suppress it. And then what they do is they have to kind of force this anger up. And that's the emotion they get to show because they need to show something. And so that's where a lot of that comes from. And there's There's been a lot of people that have made this statement, and it makes me think of this, is that the way we raise boys is we teach them not to be girls.
Mm.
And I think that goes to the fact of boys don't cry and toxic masculinity. And on a very physical level, when we cry, we release all the stress hormones out of our body. It is our body's way of naturally ridding itself of those hormones and then re-regulating. And so when we force suppression on boys and men, we are denying them a very human experience. We're denying their humanity in a lot of ways because they feel the exact same emotions that we do. And if they do not have the tools to do that, say they don't go to anger and aggression, they'll go to depression and anxiety because they'll have to force themselves into some form of shutdown and freeze in order to navigate what they're not allowed to express.
Yeah, and science shows us that when we have tears of sadness or frustration, we're actually releasing cortisol. When they test those tears, there's cortisol, which is the stress hormone in those tears, as opposed to tears that are coming from joy and happiness. So it's actually a really good way that the body, expels stress. I'd love to ask you about favoritism. A child growing up or children growing up in a family where parents have a favorite.
Yes, so this topic comes up a lot with the dysfunctional families, and there's terms like scapegoat and golden child that are typically used here. The idea is that when you have a parent that chooses a scapegoat, this is a child that they are choosing to place all of the burden and the shame and the pain of the family onto. Whenever they decide that, typically a very early age, they also start to create this story within the family of how this child is trouble and is so difficult. And to it is a way for them to give themselves permission to treat the child poorly, and then to give permission to everybody else to treat the child poorly. Typically, it's a child that mirrors back to them what is unhealthy within the family dynamic. These are usually very vibrant, creative, empathetic children. These are children who come, into this world and have something really to bring to the family. But because the family is so unhealthy, they will shut that child down, and it will be a life of punishment and criticism and just being made to feel like you're bad or wrong. They will then choose typically a golden child, which is a child a lot of times that is actually in fawning and people pleasing. It is the child that their coping mechanism is to make the parent happy, or they've learned that if they give the parent what they want, the parent will treat them well. And a lot of times they look at what's happening to the scapegoat and they're like, I absolutely do not want to be treated like that. So they will go along with it. Both of them have their own pains associated with them. But what is really sad about it is that you typically have siblings that are pitted against each other. And that's part of the dysfunctional family's agenda, is that if they're pitted against each other, then they can't talk about what's happening. They can't ever be on the same side. They can't ever form a relationship. So there is a consequence to both of the siblings and the loss of the relationship between them unless they start to realize it, which is really hard and a lot of times doesn't happen unless the golden child has been through something significant.
So it sounds like the scapegoat child is triggering the family. And then the golden child is fawning. So I can just imagine what that could look like in adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe could you walk us through it? So if the golden child is used to fawning, they'll probably get used to doing that in adulthood, which is something we've already covered. But what about the scapegoat? Is she or he acting just very small also in adulthood, just to not trigger anyone or set anyone off?
They typically go one of two ways. If their coping mechanism as a child was fight, and they were like, no, I'm going to fight against this. These are the children that will talk back, that will run away, that will find a friend group and do their own thing. If that was their coping strategy, was going into some form of fight, typically they're going to be a rebel, meaning that they're going to be okay learning how to be an outsider or to not go with the flow, because what they've learned is that in order to protect my identity and my sense of self, I actually have to just like push through and show up in this way that goes against the grain. Sometimes that is really positive. There's so many creative people that create beautiful things because that's how they've channeled that energy. But what it does on the inside is it creates this feeling of not expecting to belong or to be chosen or to be advocated or protected for. And it makes life very solitary in a sense. But there are very strong leaders, very strong creative people who take that sense of rebellion and turn it into something really empowered. We just have to make sure that we're not using it against ourselves, and we maybe need more ease and gentleness, more community, more of a sense of belonging. And then sometimes they will go into that shutdown and they will withdraw. They will feel like the bad guy. They'll be afraid of the criticism and the shaming, so they won't put themselves out there. They'll get really small. Those are usually the children that found it was safer to hide. It was safer to pull back, to slide under the radar and not be seen. And so there's many different coping mechanisms for the scapegoat, and you can have both. So you can have one in one particular area and one in another. But those are two of the ways that I see it sometimes show up in sessions.
Coming back to the golden child, I'm also just thinking about, you said sometimes they're just used to fawning and people pleasing because they didn't want to be like their scapegoat sibling. But what about the golden child that's just naturally, quote unquote, smart and got into Harvard and is just doing everything right and is receiving all this love? Might even look like they're going into adulthood with healthy bonding with their parents, with secure attachment because they were celebrated. Their family went to every baseball game that they had or every birthday or whatever because they were so celebrated. So it might almost look like this was healthy upbringing, and then the scapegoat was like the black swan, or the black sheep of the family who unfortunately was, getting the crumbs. But then this golden child is the pride and joy of the family, which we know too much of that can be unhealthy. And they might grow up with a lot of ego and arrogance or, be a little bit pompous. But at the same time, it could also look like they were just very loved and celebrated. And maybe that was healthy for their nervous system, even though their other sibling, as we said, was getting an unfortunate end of the stick. But we know that that's not a healthy dynamic in a family unit. But what if that golden child is not growing up to fawn? They're growing up with this really healthy ego and they're just succeeding and they're very smart and they're just having an amazing business, an amazing career. And they're just the ones that are getting all the golden tickets, if you will. Does that show up as well? And is there any dysfunction there?
There can be. So I would say with a child that has that experience, what would be important to ask is this what I wanted? Or is this what was expected of me and I got on board at such an early age? And then I learned to love it. So that can be part of it. Sometimes you see this in families where everybody's a doctor and then they expect the child to be a doctor, and then the child does really well, becomes a really successful doctor. But maybe the child wanted to do something completely different. And you may not know that as an adult unless you take an opportunity to actually be honest with yourself and say, is this the choice that I made for me? Or was it just what was expected of me and I rose to the occasion? So that's the idea of, am I living my life for me or for somebody else? The other thing I would say is that if there was high expectation on you and you met it and there was praise and you didn't have the shaming and all of that that the scapegoat had, it would be important to look at, did you also grow up with all of this stress and anxiety to perform? Are you still living in this space of, I need to do a good job, I have to do a good job because my self-worth is connected to it, or my sense of being loved depends on doing a good job and showing up in a certain way? I've seen a lot of people that grew up that way and they've been very successful and they've had really what we would consider on the outside beautiful lives, but they don't feel like they have inner permission to choose something different for themselves or to make decisions that go against the grain of what seems maybe like a perfect life or textbook for them.
That makes me think of really strict parents. What impact does that have on the child and then later on in adulthood? Because we're talking about, again, the expectations that were placed on them. I can see potential in my child, and therefore I'm going to be super strict so they get straight A's and a 4.0 GPA until they graduate and they get into Harvard and all that stuff. And they're capable, but like, we're very strict now. How does that manifest?
Typically in a nervous system, it's a lot of anxiety. So there's this kind of like underlying anxiety. I always feel like it's a vibration under there of just anxiety all of the time. That seems to be how the nervous system responds on a very kind of basic level. The other thing that tends to happen though is that this child doesn't grows up to feel like they are not allowed to fail and life cannot be messy. So when they are tired or say they're struggling mentally, it is really hard for them to acknowledge it because they think I just need to push through, I just need to work a little bit harder. So they tend to override the cues in their body, whether it's physically what's going on or mentally or emotionally, because drive is the thing that their body is so used to doing, the sense of like flight response that's going on.
You said, little boys have a nervous system that actually needs more codependency or co-regulation. And you said to me once that little boys need more mothering, and it's like counterintuitive to like little girls. So if we're dealing with a child that's under the age of 7, that's then dealing with a mother or a father who's very strict, how does that, because we're not maybe, showing up to school to like apply for colleges at that age. It's also a time where we're playing and learning about the world and learning about ourselves, but we also need a lot of touch. As you said, we could be a 5-year-old boy and I need hugs from mom and I need love from mom and happiness and playfulness. So if I now have strict mom, what's happening besides anxiety in the body? What am I internalizing?
I would say that one of the things you're going to internalize the most is that my value as a human is based on what I do. It's not inherent to who I am, but it's based on what I accomplish. And so that means that my worth is now, it lives outside of me. It's external. And based on how much I make these other people happy and how much I achieve. And that can be really demoralizing to any of us because what happens is we end up with patterns of unworthiness. And we typically bring in shame around it too. And so shame is really interesting in this context we're talking about because shame a lot of times is what we also learn to bring in to almost like move our nervous system to take action. So if I'm feeling, really exhausted and not wanting to do something, I will start a loop in my head, say of I am lazy and what are you doing? You need to be working harder, and we'll bring in the shame. The shame will then scare me enough that instead of going into maybe some freeze, which I need to because I need to rest, I'm going to move myself into some flight and now I'm going to take action. So that's typically one of the things I see with that experience is we'll create that cycle of like shame in order to motivate us without realizing that we're doing it.
We talked a little bit about some of the different roles children can play in family units, the scapegoat and the golden child. But what happens if you've got archetypes in the family unit that a parent is taking on? And do you see that like children start to internalize some of their parents' archetypes? For example, they display a type of despondency, or they're the strict one, or they're the hardworking one, or they're the ones that have a lot of shame. I might not have all the archetype labels right now, but it's just like what happens, or have you seen in your practice where children start to internalize examples of their parents, or they completely go the other way and they reject it?
Yes. So a couple of things come to mind in that question that might be worth looking at. One is that the idea of like, say, let's use the archetype of the hardworking parent, because that's one I think a lot of us we can understand like how clearly that one can show up, is that if you have a parent say that shows up like that in that archetype, it can sometimes become their identity. And what will happen, say, in that instance, is if you have a child who needs something from a parent, but they're a hardworking parent, they will not interrupt them or ask them for things. They will tend to kind of withdraw and cope because that identity or that archetype is so strong. So, same with like a strict parent. If we have a strict parent, that can become their identity. And that will be the parent then that we're like, we do not go to them when we've messed up because the consequence or the punishment could be really strong. So I would say we learn as children, depending on how deeply the parent embodies that archetype or that identity, we learn how to navigate it in order to get our own needs met. Now, you can have a hardworking parent who always stops what they're doing and makes time for their children. And if that's the case, the child learns very early on, oh, I can interrupt their work because I'm priority. And that feels really good to a child. But we absolutely learn how to navigate that archetype in the way that the parent wears it. And then depending on whether that archetype or identity hurt us or helped us as a child, we can either duplicate it or rebel against it. And so if it is an archetype that we saw as healthy, or it felt safe and loving and brought value to the family, like a hardworking parent who was always providing for the family and putting them first and did it with an open heart, that could look beautiful to a child. And then we'll be like, I'm going to wear that. I want some of that. But if it was one that was more where the child or the parent was absent and withdrawn and was always frustrated and angry and never took a break, then we could say, I want the exact opposite of that because that causes pain. So we do pendulate between them, just depending. And sometimes we emulate them just to try and get approval from that parent also. It really just depends, honestly, on your personal experience and what served you most as a child. What felt safest, what got you most connection or kept you, from getting attention or in trouble. And that's kind of how we navigate those a lot of times.
What about when you have very controlling parents in the house, or if you have a passive parent in the house? What does that look like in the family unit?
Yes, so controlling parents can come in a lot of different varieties. There can be controlling, and it's very much based on, I want you to get this perfect and we need to look like the perfect family. Going back to even there are opportunities you have and I want you to have a good life. So there can be control in that sense of directing the child's life. There can also be control a lot of times that comes up within religion, because there is this idea of needing to train or force a child to show up in a certain way, going back again to emotionally immature parents where there's this idea of good and bad. And so when there is that type of control, a lot of times shame is also used to try and control the child. There tends to be a lack of explaining and open communication because it's more of the parent saying, I'm right, you're wrong, and you don't get to be seen or heard. You will just listen to what I have to say. When you have a passive parent, where it really can be harmful is when you have a controlling, or say a controlling parent in the house and then a passive parent. So if you have a controlling or abusive parent in the house that is causing a lot of harm to the child, is yelling, screaming, physically harmful, whatever type of trauma might be going on there. And then you have a passive parent, the parent who is maybe shut down, dealing with their own mental health stuff, or just emotionally withdrawn and choosing not to participate. You end up feeling as a child that the passive parent didn't protect you, that they should have stood up for you, but they, on some level, chose not to intercede. And so those are two different types of betrayals from parents. One with the controlling can be this betrayal of, I'm not allowed any autonomy. I do not get to choose who I want to be in this life. And the other is with the passive parent, the betrayal of, it was your job to protect me and you didn't. You let me suffer. Both can be really painful to deal with and to heal from.
And so how does that present in adulthood, and how can we support people who have had parents like that?
Yes, so I find that when you grew up with controlling parents, a lot of times, especially, I have a lot of clients that have come out of different religious traditions, and the control and the fear that was placed on them was so strong that it is a process of healing this feeling of, I can be safe making new choices, because they have been taught that there is only one way to do something, and if they don't do it, the punishment or consequence is really extreme. And so there is a lot of fear in the nervous system that if I do something differently, there could be a really big consequence to me. And what that can feel like is this sense of like, oh, dread, and like, oh, something's going to happen, kind of like doom is coming, catastrophizing, that if I'm If I'm happy, something bad will happen. If I do this and my parents don't like it or society doesn't like it, then I'm going to be in trouble. And sometimes it even looks like I'm going to go to jail. I'm good. The police are going to come. There's so many variations of how the fear can manifest in us. But what it requires in us is learning how to calm our nervous system, how to create safety, and then how to build permission within ourselves to make new choices. And making new choices a lot of times looks like holding our old beliefs and feeling safe enough to hold the possibility of a new belief and sit with kind of this discomfort of what do I believe? And that takes a lot of emotional maturity. So if you're doing that work, you're doing really big work actually. In one instance, you can also have a controlling father and a passive mother, which is fairly common type of dynamic. And as a child, if you experience that, what you learn is that authority figure, which is typically the father, can be very controlling and demanding and all powerful. And that typically in that experience, the only emotions that are allowed are anger and aggression from him. Yours will never be allowed. They'll be denied. And because you have a passive mother who is not protecting you and providing this emotional support and connection to help you process that experience or to keep you safe, what you end up doing also is starting to internalize a lot of the feelings that you're having. Because on one hand, I have all this aggression and conflict coming at me, and on another, I don't have a safe space to run to, which can end up creating a lot of freeze in our nervous systems. This is when we see children that are really isolated and start to shut down because they've learned that, especially with aggressive fathers, although it definitely happens with mothers as well, but if I was to use my anger, my fight, to fight back with my father, it might actually escalate more. And because there is a difference in power dynamic, some because of parent-child, but also because of size, we learn very early on a coping strategy of dealing with conflict and aggression. And a lot of times that's when we carry into adulthood. And we don't always reevaluate and adjust it to realize that power dynamics change. Our size, our physical size changes. There are a lot of children that reach a certain age, particularly sons, because with daughters it doesn't typically happen, but sons will get older and they'll become stronger or taller or bigger than their father, and all of a sudden their fight energy can come back to them and they can protect themselves. Women typically don't have access to that because their father is typically always stronger than them. And so women usually have to heal much more in the space of calling back healthy aggression, which is my ability to say, no, you don't get to treat me like that. These are my boundaries. I will not tolerate this. It takes us a lot longer because that is a lesson that we have to learn in different ways.
I heard that a father's role is really important for children, especially for sons, but daughters as well, to learn how to regulate anger and aggression. And if we don't have a strong, healthy father figure, then we don't know how to regulate very normal and healthy human emotion. Like we're all going to experience anger and aggression in our life, but we need to know how to channel it and to regulate it. And a mother's role is kind of to help regulate more of that compassionate, the sadness, the anxiety, the kind of despondency that we might feel in our lives. And that's a mother's role. And if those two are not healthy figures in a child's life, then that's when we feel dysregulated with those particular emotions. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the one thing, this comes from not specifically like somatic and trauma work, but just in general from like more of the spiritual work, is that we typically look at fathers as providing children with validation and permission to show up in their personal power. So exactly what you're saying. If a father has healthy anger, a child learns that they can say, no, I don't like that. And they're not going to be met with force. They're going to be met with a father that says, tell me more, let's talk through this. Let's work through this. So he doesn't devalue and tear the child down. He helps meet the child in that conflict. So there's healthy resolution, but there's also a healthy sense of self because the child is like, oh, I get to show up and be who I am safely, which is huge. Fathers don't realize, I think a lot of times, how powerful that lesson is for children. If they can meet the child's conflict and anger with understanding and gentleness, it's transformative in a child's life. And then to the emotions you were speaking about with a mother, they teach children that they are worthy of unconditional love, which creates profound safety in a person when they realize that I am not what I do, what I accomplish, how perfect I am. I am unconditionally loved as I am. And so that's the balance really that we're talking about too, is that when we have both of those lessons, we're very empowered adults, very safe adults.
Have you seen in your experience that if a person goes through serious childhood trauma, that they're less empathetic in adulthood? And what do I mean by this? They're less empathetic or sensitive to people who have common daily issues because they're just like, I've been through so much. Your work problem or that annoying email or your canceled flight, which, yes, as a health coach, I help people regulate the stress of daily life and the small traumas that we all go through in adulthood. But they don't have the empathy that we need in society. And I don't know if you've come across that in your experience or if there's a clinical reason that the trauma has like blocked that side. They're just like, I don't have, I don't have compassion for someone who hasn't gone through something massive. And how do you think that impacts society?
I think you're spot on with that. And I hear it in sessions all the time where people voice that same exact thing. I could care less about XYZ because this is what I've had to deal with. The way that I've always approached it from the coaching side is that what I hear when people say that is that they were never validated, witnessed, or supported in their pain and in their trauma. So it's like a backlog, is how I typically view it. And they just need space held for them. If there is space held, then it becomes less comparative. We're not in like comparative suffering of whose is worse. There's space for everybody's at the table, big or small. And so I find that the more a person is heard, listened to, feels like what they went through mattered and it's not judged or held against them, that it is held with care and love, the more compassion they have available to other people for, say, just road rage or, coffee was wrong or whatever it is that's stressful to another person in the course of their day.
Or something more significant, like your best friend is going through a breakup, like, yeah, I might not even have time if someone's complaining about their coffee coming, cold. Like we don't always have time for all that stuff, right? So I make a joke out of it, but I'm talking about the hard things that we go through in life, like a breakup or like moving countries, it's hard as an adult, or trying to build community or losing their job. It might not be a big trauma like what they've experienced in their childhood, but it's still something difficult that an adult can go through. And if your really close friend or sister or brother or cousin is going through that, so it's someone in your near and dear circle in your community, but you're not having empathy, I just can see how that could perpetuate throughout society. It can ripple. And I feel like that's something we really need to take seriously.
I think that until the narrative fully changes around what trauma is, people will always feel that their pain is being invalidated and dismissed. And so what becomes stressful and dysregulating for somebody who's actively in the process of dealing with trauma can be super, super minimal inconveniences during a day. And so I think what we have to look at is the capacity of their nervous system is barely able to get them through the day. Having to take on somebody else's problem is more than their system can handle. And so the more we can hold space for the conversations of trauma and what it really looks like, I think the less people are going to feel defensive also, that they need to protect, right, their space that they get to take up with their story and what's going on. The more ease they're going to have in their bodies around, I can hold space for you, because I know that that sucked too. Most people who've been through trauma are deeply compassionate. What happens is I think they get so numbed out because they're dealing with their own trauma and trauma responses every day and the overwhelm of it, that it's more in the land of capacity is shutting down. Like my capacity is full. I don't have any bandwidth available.
I'd love to ask you, what are some of the first steps that someone can take to help break them from toxic family cycles?
One of the most powerful things you could do would be to actually educate yourself on what the signs a family dysfunction looks like and what's healthy versus unhealthy. So many of us have been in it for so long that we actually don't know what's healthy because it hasn't been modeled to us. And that is why I really do love the book Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. It's a phenomenal resource and it breaks down very specifically what these dysfunctions look like. And if you feel like you are a child who was raised as a scapegoat in a narcissistic or dysfunctional family, there is another good book called Scapegoats of Narcissistic Families. And it is such a great resource for realizing all the ways that you've been shamed and guilted and blamed and injured really over a lifetime. Because when your experience has always been what it is, it's really hard to discern that that's not real, not true, or that there's a different way of being because your perception of yourself has been so altered by it.
Thanks for sharing those books. And also, another resource I've come across is by the holistic psychologist. I don't know if you know her. She talks a lot about like family dynamics and dysfunction in family units. And she had a really good book that I read. I think it's called Doing the Work or How to Do the Work. So it discusses a lot of the subjects we unpacked today, but she also gives like practical tips and strategies of how to help heal yourself from these traumas. What are some of the common mistakes you see when people are trying to draw boundaries with their families or trying to move forward with their traumas or trying to heal? Do you see that people maybe move too fast or don't know how to communicate properly and then they kind of relapse or reverse any of the progress they're trying to make?
One of the things that I think systematically trips us all up is feeling like I have to prove why I feel what I feel to the family that hurt me. And so if you're in a space of feeling like you have to prove why you've been hurt in order to justify healing or changing something, I would say the best thing you could do is just step back. If we can stop proving that we've been hurt to other people, we can start to recognize what we actually need in order to start healing because we're not looking for external permission to heal anymore. And also, the people that hurt you very, 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 very rarely are going to validate it for you. And you're going to be back in a cycle of pain all over again. That would be the number one thing. The other thing would be boundaries are really, really important. And in the beginning, when you're healing from dysfunctional families, they really need to be super strong. So, one of the things that I've learned is that if you can remove yourself from the situation and just take a break, we're not talking about going no contact or anything like that, but just pull back a bit. See how you feel when you're not doing day-to-day life or having to do daily, a phone call each week with somebody who triggers you or going to all of these family events. How do you feel when you can pull back and kind of take stock of where you're really at and what feels good to you? A lot of us are taught as children that if we can tolerate it, we should do it. And that is not a mechanism for health. What we should be looking at is, do I have capacity? Do I want to do it? Is it good for me to do it? And so we need to renegotiate when we're doing boundaries what it is that we're allowing ourselves, our time, our energy to be given to.
I think the piece where you said your family member is probably not going to validate you, you're not going to get the apology or the recognition maybe you're looking for unless that parent or that family member has done some serious inner reflection and work, which would be incredible. But a lot of the time that doesn't happen. So, how do you move forward with that? How do you begin to forgive? How do you begin to acknowledge and validate yourself and also just heal the relationship with someone? And maybe healing it could be, as you said, setting boundaries. Like, you're not out of my life, but we have different boundaries. But like, how do I feel better about this relationship when this person has caused me so much harm in my adolescence?
I think that the best thing we can do is take responsibility on our end first, and not for the actions, but responsibility for our healing, meaning that I have to be really honest about how I feel and how it hurt me. A lot of us have this fantasy of what happened because it was too hard as a child to look at the truth. And so we create this fantasy. I have to be really willing to be honest with myself about what I experienced. And I can no longer deny the experience and the emotions and the impact it has had on me. That's the first place. So if I can do that, I can validate my own experience, which means then I can get really clear on what it is that I need in order to heal, to have my needs met, to have relationship with these people, and then I can put those things into action. When you start putting those things into action, that's a lot of work. And there's going to be a lot of triggers that come up. So I would recommend doing some emotional work around that or doing some somatic work, which is a lot of what I do is that we have stuff that's held in the nervous system where it feels unsafe, like we talked about the fawning and the flight and the freeze. We really have to tend to those when we're dealing with childhood trauma. Otherwise, we might have mentally done all of this work and be excited to show up in a new way, but our body can pull back patterns because it's so ingrained in us. So I would say emotional work and physical, the somatic work of healing trauma are two of the best places to lean into. Sometimes you do them at the same time, sometimes you do them separately.
And you said take responsibility for how you feel, but I guess also like for life. And this is not, again, taking responsibility for anything that's happened to you, especially as a child. But just maybe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you're the trauma coach, just coming to terms with this is my life. How do I want to live it? I've only got one, and take
Yes.
full responsibility for something terrible maybe happened to me or there's trauma, but I no longer want to live small. I want to learn to take up space. I no longer want to feel invalidated. I no longer want to have this pain. I have one beautiful life and let me live it to its fullest, so there's some kind of ownership or responsibility there that helps people, I feel, get out of a victim mindset. It's a lot of the times the way I work with clients, but I also don't have clients because it's out of my scope, that have capital T trauma or very complex trauma from their childhood. That is out of my scope. So I don't know if you would agree with that.
I think that it is going back also, it's a beautiful tie in to when we were talking about when you become older and physically bigger and there's a power dynamic change. And that's part of it too, recognizing that you have control over your life, that you are capable of making new decisions, new choices in your life. That is also that power dynamic shifting to where you're remembering, okay, it's not the same as it was when I was a child. I actually have some agency now that I can act on.
Are there any tips you can give to people when they're trying to communicate with a parent where there was dysfunction or another family member? Because sometimes we struggle with sharing how we felt in childhood or with someone that feels a little bit threatening to us or with someone we're not sure how to set a boundary with. So is there any communication techniques that you could share with us?
The two things that I think are always so important is one, make sure that when you do communicate, you're communicating from a place of as much safety as possible in the nervous system. Meaning, I'm not doing it in the moment when I'm triggered and angry or I'm feeling afraid. I'm going to remove myself, take care of myself, get to a better place of safety, and then I'm going to communicate. I think that's definitely number one. The other is that depending on what feels safest to you, the mode of communication and the timing of communication are really important. So if you're trying to carry out a conversation with somebody and it's at a family event or it's somewhere in public, that's a no-brainer for it. It's probably not going to go well because the other person's going to be defensive. If it is somebody that typically is maybe a bit more scary to you or you're worried about it, have support there. So thinking about the method of delivery and the timing of it so that it is as peaceful as is possible. It's not always 100% possible, but as much as possible. And that you are delivering from a place of as much safety as possible in your system and not triggers. Those two things are some of the best things that you can do for yourself because you are also not required to respond to somebody who might be coming at you with some conflict or hurt in that moment. You can remove yourself, take care of yourself, get in a better way, and then come back to it.
Would you also say that I statements versus you statements are helpful? Like, I feel this way, I experience this way, instead of like, you did this to me, it's your fault, you're the one who did one, two, three. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that kind of nonviolent communication. And this is where doing a lot of your own work, to be honest, with what your experience is, can be really helpful too, because it can help you get to those statements, those I statements, and it can help you understand more clearly what it is that you're wanting to communicate. When I have people that are trying to get out years worth of pain to somebody, my recommendation is always just think of it as when you turn on a faucet that has been off for years, it's going to be dirty water at first till it clears. Write the dirty letter, like get it out and then write it again and kind of synthesize it, distill it down to what is actually important. And I feel like all of us should do that before we have really big conversations, because we need to get to what is actually most important to us, not a whole bunch of details sometimes that tend to derail us.
Aspen, this was such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Before we close, where can people find you? I will link your Instagram below, but are there any other resources or links that you'd like to share? Or if somebody would like to work with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yes, so my website is augustknoxcoaching.com. So there's resources there. There's also there's links to work with me and opportunities. We can work on inner child and also trauma. And Instagram is probably where I am the most. That's where most of my content goes, for sure.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time and for unpacking all these different topics with us. I hope the listeners feel like we have helped them. I hope no one is too overwhelmed. I know this can be a very tricky and sensitive and sometimes heavy subject. I hope we relieved some stigma and understanding that this is a safe, non-judgmental space. We're not here to judge any parenting styles or any family units. We're just here to help heal everybody.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Please share with family and friends that you feel could benefit from this episode, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review to support the show. Check out the links below for more information about my guests and where to find them. And make sure you're following me on Instagram at wholesome_practice to learn more about what I do. I appreciate you being here, and see you on the next one. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of your doctor or physician. Always consult a medical professional before making any changes or adding anything new to your diet, lifestyle, or medication protocol.